Hello, I'm Jeff Sachs. I'm the past president of the Federation of Associations in Behavioral and Brain Sciences, FABBS, located in Washington, D.C. I'm exceedingly happy to join you today for a conversation with my friend and colleague, Calvin Lai. FABBS is a nonprofit coalition of 33 scientific societies and around 60 academic departments committed to advancing scientific understanding of the mind, brain, and behavior. FABBS is deeply committed to advancing inclusivity, diversity, equity, and accessibility, IDEA, and to recognizing scholars whose research, mentorship, and service meaningfully advance these principles in the behavioral sciences. The Kellina Craig-Henderson Early to Mid-Career Award for IDEA was established to recognize scholars who have made a significant impact on the promotion and advancement of IDEA principles within the behavioral and brain sciences and the broader scientific community. The award is named in honor of Dr. Kellina Craig-Henderson, who made notable contributions to IDEA and to the field through her leadership at the National Science Foundation, including as head of the Social, Behavioral, and Economic Sciences Directorate. The 2026 award goes to Dr. Calvin Lai, who is a faculty member of Psychology and Criminal Justice and director of the Diversity Science Lab at Rutgers University. Dr. Lai's research focuses on implicit bias, prejudice, and discrimination. His lab develops and tests psychological interventions aimed at reducing hidden biases, conducts large-scale studies on intergroup biases, and provides resources to support research and education on these topics. Dr. Lai's work exemplifies research, mentorship, and service that advance IDEA principles in the behavioral sciences. I also want to note that Calvin was also honored this year with the FABBS Early Career Impact Award. So it's been a big year. Congratulations, Calvin. It's such a pleasure to speak with you today.
Well, thank you so much for having me, and it's such an honor to be the recipient of both of these awards and to kind of carry the torch on the Craig Henderson Award in particular for issues related to diversity, equity, inclusion that are so near and dear to my heart and my professional life.
So to start, I want to ask what drew you to psychology, and I want to ask about how your academic or personal experiences shaped your interest in studying implicit bias, prejudice, and discrimination.
Yeah, I mean the kind of like very origin of the story was over something quite silly, which was that my senior year I could take an elective, and I just heard that the social science class had videos in it, and that we would just get to watch a lot of videos. And so I signed up for a class that was not psychology, it was sociology, and so that was actually my kind of first social science love. And I entered as an undergraduate studying both psychology and sociology. And one of the things that I loved about both sciences is that they help illuminate, at least for me, a lot of experiences of inequality that I did not previously have vocabulary for, right? About these kind of subtle or hidden instances of discrimination that didn't quite fit into what you would often learn in a regular kind of K-12 education in North America about, say, the history of slavery or World War II and the Holocaust. That modern forms of discrimination often looked quite different from these kind of older historical forms. I originally had aspirations to be a sociologist, but ultimately it was the love of experiments, of at least daring to try to establish cause, to randomly assign, to establish causal inference that drew me to social psychology in particular. And I really do want to kind of give a plug for my undergraduate mentor. Her name was Lori Rudman, a social psychologist, and she actually used to be an actress and would say that one of the wonderful things about running social psych experiments was that in some ways you're designing this kind of, or you're kind of creating this type of play, but your actors are your participants. You're seeing how they act out your play. And that kind of metaphor has often kind of really kept with me through my career of designing many different experiments where I just want to see, what happens.
Cool. So this award is intended to recognize scientists who advance idea principles through what they study or through how they exemplify the principles of inclusivity, diversity, equity, and accessibility in the conduct of their science. And your work really embraces both of these aspects. You do the science and you do all of these things as a professional that reflect what we found with this science. And so I wanted to ask how you see the things that you've discovered in your scientific life relating to how you approach being an academic and a human in 2026.
Yeah, yeah. So, a lot of my research is ultimately concerned with how we can undo or prevent or mitigate bias or discrimination. Often, racial discrimination, but also other forms of discrimination as well. And one of the things that we find again and again in our research is that there, unfortunately, it's not a silver bullet, and not for lack of trying. That oftentimes what it means to reduce inequality is ultimately this kind of like huge hodgepodge of small little interventions or reforms here or there that oftentimes moral transformation, a dramatic kind of eureka moment where people's prejudices wash away. They can happen, but they're relatively rare, or they happen slowly over cultural time, and that has really informed my practice as a kind of practitioner or someone who's trying to give our science away in trying to meet members of the public and stakeholders halfway and finding what are these kind of practical solutions or things that we can do right now to address discrimination, given that we live in a world where people are going to hold these prejudices, they're going to hold these biases, whether intentional or not. And so a lot of times I think of this kind of dynamic between my research and my practice as a kind of more public intellectual about, how can the science help us identify what is working for reducing discrimination? And then also how can we implement, execute, and deliver that in a way that is useful for people also trying to reduce inequality in the organizations or societies that they live in. So I think that to me is my kind of main ethos in seeing this kind of um, feedback loop between the work that we do as scientists in describing and documenting and the work that we do in trying to make our science kind of useful for people writ large.
So when my students or folks that I meet out in the world ask me, how do I make less biased decisions and be um, more consistent with my values, um, I turn to literature that I encountered a number of years ago that focuses on type one and type two thinking, and that basically says the first thing you can do is slow down, disaggregate the decisions, and implement, you know, deliberative procedures that are consistent with your values. Is that still like good empirically supported advice, or has the literature modified that conclusion?
I'll give my personal impression. I think there are kind of two major caveats when we're thinking about this in everyday life. The first is that, how much time you have to deliberate over a decision is not often a personal choice. You
Great point.
know,
Yep.
if you're just living your life, let's say you're a teacher, you just have to grade 100 papers by tomorrow, or hopefully not 100 papers by tomorrow, but 100 assignments by tomorrow or something. If you're a healthcare professional or a police officer, right? Sometimes you just schedule these incredibly long hours. And so whether you have time or ability to deliberate, some of that is up to your control, but some of that is up to the whims of just what your life is, right? Whether your time is kind of torn apart by all your different commitments, by caretaking duties and so on. And so when I think of that as a kind of practical point of intervention, there are some circumstances where you might want to be like, well, maybe instead of um, looking over this stack of applications at the end of the day when I'm exhausted, I'm going to do it when I'm more fresh and ready. There's some self-control aspect that you can do there, but a lot of it is kind of structurally determined by the kind of flow of what our lives are. So I do want to kind of give some grace about the fact that we can't just choose to deliberate all the time. Part of why we don't deliberate all the time is that we just do not have the bandwidth to do so. The second of which I think is also a point of concern, not to say that we shouldn't think about slowing down our decision making to prevent bias, but that sometimes that itself can help foster biases, right? And a lot of this we can think of through, what social psychologists call motivated reasoning, where maybe you start off with an initial attitude or inclination, and when you are spending time thinking more about it or seeking more information about it, you might end up, seeking, say, ammunition for your argument that maybe confirms and strengthens your pre-existing bias rather than uh, becoming less biased by default. And so I think it's often important, if you can, to have more deliberation, but also to be, I guess, deliberate about your deliberation, about what you are doing with your deliberation time to ensure that you are thinking about things from multiple angles and not using your deliberation as a way to kind of justify the biases that you might have. And I think a lot of times people are, if they treat it as a kind of habit of mind, are more able to identify when they're engaging in that kind of biased information seeking or biased, reasoning than they might give themselves credit for.
That's a great answer. Okay, switching gears a little bit, I want to ask about mentorship. Mentorship is an important part of advancing idea in the behavioral sciences. And I wanted to ask, how you approach mentoring students and trainees, particularly students from historically underrepresented backgrounds and students who are interested in socially engaged research.
Yeah, I think that for me, the one thing that has always been really powerful in my mind when I think about effective mentorship, particularly when we're talking about students that are not, coming from backgrounds where they have a lot of that kind of cultural capital and know how academia works, is just to be extremely explicit about what expectations are, about how different procedures or norms work. And so one of the things I was recommended to do that I really cherish is to just write a lab manual. To try to document and have members of my lab help contribute to document all these different things about what it is like to be in our lab, to be a productive researcher, how to think about different expectations. And over time, it's also just kind of accumulated a lot of other, pointed out to a lot of other external resources as well about um, just how science works. So much of this, in some ways, feels like a new world where you just have all of this new etiquette and norms that you have to navigate all the time. And so a lot of my mentorship work is oriented about just trying to be as transparent as possible about the life in academia, right? Not just like how to be a grad student, but also what it's like, to be faculty or what it's like when you're on the job market and stuff like that. Um, Another thing that I also think about, particularly when I'm thinking of like early career scholars studying issues related to diversity, equity, inclusion is about kind of walking this line between the fact that ultimately our job as scientists is to document, to describe, and to inform, while at the same time, right? Many of us study these topics because we have some type of personal stake or interest in issues related to diversity, and equity, and inclusion, and so. Um, One of the things I really try to model in some of the stuff that we do is to be kind of transparent about our science, to document what our expectations, our priors, our hypotheses are, and to try to keep our minds open, particularly when inevitably we get results that kind of go against our ideological priors, our what we want the world to be, right? Because ultimately, I think when it comes to creating effective intervention or social reform, it doesn't help anyone if we're putting out science that is portraying a warped view of, say, what's effective in addressing inequality. And so a lot of times in our lab, we talk a lot about the importance of publishing those null results because oftentimes if we're trying to make something work in the real world, it's just as important to know what doesn't work as it is to know what does work.
Good. And I know from having read those papers that you walk that walk as well as talking that talk.
Yeah.
Okay, so another thing that's really always impressed me about your practice is your willingness to get out and provide talks and training for groups who can make use of the science base on implicit bias and discrimination. You've been an advisor to corporations and to police forces. You've spoken for all kinds of audiences. Tell me about how that came about and why you continue to make it a priority.
Yeah. A lot of it to me, like in hindsight, it feels a little bit about just being in the right place at the right time. Um, a lot of academia is kind of who you know, and there's just at certain points in my career where you a lot of times it just takes one connection, and that can kind of steamroll into a whole host of them. Right? I think like through a friend of a friend, I once got recommended for to do some expert witness work for a public defender, and once I was known for doing that, it was very easy to kind of pick up additional expert witness work. What I would recommend kind of from a practical perspective in terms of how to think about this with agency is that a lot of times, right, if you put yourself out there, right, that you're interested in doing this type of stuff, those opportunities can come, right? So I've had earlier career scholars that have mentioned that they're also interested in expert witness work. And so when some of that stuff um, hits my plate, I'm often like, well, I don't have the bandwidth to do it, but here's someone that's really interested in doing it and will probably charge a lower rate as well for expert witness work, for example. So I think a lot of it is just kind of just trying to put yourself out there, making sure that you're getting a place where you can hear about those opportunities or letting people know that you want those opportunities. I think that's a lot of how those types of connections initially happen. And I think part of it is also, choosing to do research that is of public interest, right? That helps people narrate the news and current events, helps them build an additional piece of vocabulary to understand, why things are happening the way that they are, right? And so some of that is just going to come out depending on what type of research that you're doing. And I don't want to sell that part short as well. That, you know, it has been easier in some ways because my research has often been pretty policy relevant for people to kind of come to my lab to study or come to me or my lab out of interest for those topics.
That totally makes sense. Relatedly, you've been involved for a long time with Project Implicit. For our viewers who aren't familiar with it, Project Implicit is a very, very large web-based study of implicit bias and related phenomena that's been running for many years now. It's really a platform in which researchers launch studies that accrue large numbers of participants who participate because they're interested and they get to learn a little bit about their own behavior. So you've been involved with it for a long time. You continue to serve on its advisory board. Can you tell me a bit about that?
Yeah, so it is one of the first um, social science platforms on the internet, like ever. It originally launched in '98, so it's been almost 30 years now. I just recently heard that we are over 60
Can
million
I just stop
visitors.
and say how old that makes me feel? It makes me feel super old.
Yeah, I mean, I was thinking that the other day too, because I was always rounding it down to 20, but I feel like, we're in 2026 now. It's getting close to the end of the decade. We're getting closer. But yeah, so it's been around for almost 30 years, 60 million people. We don't have like a formal count of how many papers, but we know it's definitely at least 200. It would not surprise me over 300 papers plus have been published using data from the website, which includes both kind of these large studies where we just collect people taking different social cognition tasks and also just kind of more experimental work similar to a psychology pool. And it's just been huge for public education about bias, about social cognition, and has been really tremendous for getting people to like notice a part of their mental lives that they might not normally notice, right? That something is going on in their minds that's causing them to do something, in this case, right, show racial bias or gender bias, despite their conscious intentions. And so that has been just really great in getting some of the scientific ideas out there, right? Making it kind of engaging and almost like this kind of room random game. And it's also been, you know, the lifeblood of a lot of the research on the topic itself. And, because the data is so mature now that people are doing these types of analyses that are almost impossible with any other topic, where, some of the hottest research in implicit biases these days is looking at how implicit biases vary over um, cultural time, like how cultural events seem to relate to changes in implicit bias, and also how implicit bias and also kind of more explicit blatant prejudices vary across regions, across cultures, across even individual counties within the United States, and finding what explains how biases vary across space as well. And so that has been stuff that you could not do if we didn't have some of these data sets with millions of people, and has been really useful for understanding how individual biases or individual thoughts or cognitions or feelings aggregate up into these kind of societal patterns, these societal inequalities. And so that's kind of my general overview of Project Implicit. What makes me continually so excited about it. A lot of the day-to-day work is more just looking at spreadsheets, as is a lot of stuff, but that's what kind of keeps me going at the end of the day on at the board.
Cool. Yeah, I mean, we're still doing behavioral science here.
Yeah.
Uh, there's there will be spreadsheets.
Yeah.
Um, okay, last question. I want to ask what advice or encouragement you'd like to share with early career scholars who want to conduct rigorous research while also contributing to a more inclusive and equitable behavioral science.
Okay, so I'm gonna make a persuasive appeal that I don't think is necessarily safe, which is that I think that for those of us who have studied issues related to diversity, equity, inclusion, accessibility broadly, that we have described a lot. There's been a lot of description, and a lot of times the kind of default is to assume that, well, someone else will figure it out how to apply it for us. And that's just not true, right? That unlike, say, the hard sciences where you can have things like physics and chemistry, but then you have entire disciplines of engineering, the psychological and brain sciences don't have engineers. And so in some ways we have to be the engineers ourselves in figuring out how to translate some of this kind of more basic science, some of this more descriptive science into things that people can actually use in the real world. And there's entire sciences around just figuring out this kind of implementation component where you're things that you maybe might not privilege that much in the lab, like, for those of us in social cognition, right? We might often think a lot about the cognitive aspect and not so much about, say, the motivational, habitual aspects of the things that we study, right? Those things become so much more relevant when you're studying what people are doing day to day. And so I think that what I would kind of recommend to early career scholars is to jump on that. There's so much low hanging fruit for us to learn in just how to give our science away, how to take some of these kind of basic psychological principles we know about how people are thinking or feeling about themselves or others, and then translating that to see how we can actually materially improve people's lives or help them make more just, more fair, less biased decisions. That you that it feels a lot of times that we're just one of not that many, just plucking these kind of low-hanging fruits. There's so many low-hanging fruits there, and I hope that some early career scholars will jump in on it with us. So
So we can't just throw it over the fence. You've got to do the work to translate.
yeah, yeah. And it's not how our science has historically been set up. But sometimes we should be the change that we want to see.
I can't think of a better note to end on. Thank you so much, Calvin, for making the time today and for the work that you're doing on behalf of the science and the community. Um, and again, congratulations on both of these awards from FABBS. It's been a pleasure talking with you today.
Yes, and thank you so much. It's been a pleasure talking. It's such an honor. And yeah,